In this video, we're going to focus on some of the theocratic structures of government within Iran, as opposed to some of the elected ones like the presidency and the majlis. So the first question to focus on is, why does Iran have religious institutions that essentially serve as a check or a filter on a lot of the elected institutions and a lot of the political figures within the country? So we talked about the term velayat-e-faqih, which roughly translates to essentially juris guardianship. But because of the revolution of 1979, because essentially the goal within the government is to perpetuate a system of sort of Islamic law and Islamism based on Shia law. They believe that power to make key decisions should be made by clergy and religious leaders. So essentially trying to perpetuate a system in which the supreme leader is sort of the key chosen by God, they believe, figure within the country. And that there is a lot of religious experts that essentially are looking at laws, looking at the conduct of political candidates, looking at the candidates themselves, and making sure that they comply with their interpretation of Islam. So it's a system that I like, and in some weird ways, kind of similar to judicial review, in that they are essentially looking at sort of what is produced by the government and making sure that it complies with what they see as the basis for their law, which is the Quran. So kind of within that, we start with the supreme leader. So as I said before, the supreme leader is ultimately seen as the leader of Shia Islam for both the people in Iran and for people outside of the country. So there's a lot of connection that Iran has with Shia groups and Shia kind of political groups and military groups that exist with outside of the country as well. And the supreme leader is essentially the highest person within the religion. So as we said before, lots of complexity within the system. We're going to be focused in on the Guardian Council, on the supreme leader, and the Assembly of Experts, and the Expediency Council in this video. But a very complex system. And the way that I sort of explain the role of the theocratic institutions is to serve directly as a check on the power of a lot of the other institutions. So we'll start with the supreme leader. So currently, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and he has been the supreme leader since 1989, so he's getting up there in age. And he is the supreme leader within Iran, is the head of state. So essentially, the most powerful political figure within the country, the political figure that is oftentimes kind of the symbol to the rest of the world of Iran and its government, but also of Shia Islam itself. And it is the supreme leader, kind of who fills the position, is chosen by the clerics who make up the Assembly of Experts. So essentially, they have a governmental body or a religious/political institution whose job it is to appoint the next supreme leader, as well as do a few other things. But usually it's chosen by the clerics who make up the Assembly of Experts. And kind of within the system, it's kind of manifests itself in interesting ways that we'll talk about. So it's a lifetime appointment. So Iran has only had 2 supreme leaders since the revolution in 1979, Khomeini and Khamenei. And the supreme leader is expected to act as a trustee of the community by supervising politics and ensuring laws conform to Islam. So like we said before, essentially kind of widespread power to make sure that what's happening within Iran's political system is conforming to essentially the laws that they believe to be true. So, and then seen by many as the leader of Islamic faith. We talked about that. So kind of, as you can imagine, widespread powers. So someone called the supreme leader, not surprising, but essentially the supreme leader has the power to limit presidential candidates, and kind of most interestingly in some ways, to overrule the president or to just outright dismiss the president. So that is a power that is you know, as you can imagine, is pretty wide, is pretty big stick within the system. Seen as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, can declare war and peace. So we saw that in the 80s with the Iran-Iraq war, and a lot of the role that the supreme leader played within that. Appoints a lot of important positions within the government. So the head of the judiciary, half the Guardian Council, which we'll talk about in a second. And then most importantly, I think in some ways, kind of the symbolic or the the outward figure from the country. So, as we said before, Ruhollah Khomeini was the first supreme leader from 1979 to 1989 after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And then Khomeini takes charge in 1989. He essentially, interestingly, was sort of a thought initially to be sort of a caretaker or sort of a compromise between different elements of the government. And he's held this position essentially for 31 years. And it's interesting kind of to think about what will happen, who will take this role kind of when he is no longer able to fill the position. So kind of interesting to think about kind of where kind of the next supreme leader will become from. And there's always a lot of speculation outside of the country about that. All right, so the supreme leader, as we said before, as you can tell by the name, oftentimes seen as the predominant figure within the country or within the political system. But there's lots and lots and lots of other important kind of institutions that exist on the kind of religious side of the government. So the most important other is definitely the Guardian Council. So this is going to be a group that has essentially 2 or 3 main roles, and we'll talk about those in a second. But essentially, it's made up of 12 different men serving 6-year terms. So we said the supreme leader has a lifetime appointment. These essentially are chosen half by the supreme leader and then half by the head of judiciary, which, as we just talked about, is chosen by the supreme leader. So you can kind of get where that's coming from. But kind of interestingly enough, they do have to be approved by the Majlis, or from a list kind of provided to the Majlis. But essentially 12 members that have a lot of power and do a lot of really interesting things. So the most important thing that they probably do is they have the power to determine who can run in local, presidential, parliamentary, and the Assembly of Religious Experts elections. So, and they use this power in a very, very widespread way. So oftentimes, lots and lots of people, they essentially decide who runs in each election, which, as you can imagine, is a ton of power. So for presidential elections, they manage to exclude a lot of important political figures often, and it's interesting to see the kind of who is chosen to run in the election, and to think about sort of why they're chosen and what they represent, and how that represents maybe the direction that the powers that be within the country want to take the country in. So just as an example of that, kind of in the recent parliamentary elections, tons and tons and tons of candidates for the Majlis were excluded, which is not uncommon. But interestingly, there were a lot of people who were currently members of the Majlis who were essentially excluded from running again. So the Guardian Council has a widespread power to veto or to vet kind of people running for different seats within the country. And most of, if not all, the Guardian Council are comprised of sort of hardliners or conservatives within the system. So not surprisingly, a lot of the people that make the power within the country, excluding in some ways the president, and which is an interesting kind of relationship. But a lot of these people are hardliners and tend to take the country in a more conservative way. So it's interesting to see that. And the second big thing is the council also has the power to veto any legislation that's passed by the legislature, kind of if they believe it to be at odds with basic tenets of Islam. So they are able to essentially serve as a check on the unicameral legislature that exists within the country. So it's interesting the extent to which Iran has a unicameral legislature, but it also has a separate body that can check or veto the legislation that's passed. So that takes us to the Expediency Council, which is another institution that is primarily it's a lot of the same folks, kind of in the other parts of the government. And essentially what their main job is to do is to settle disputes when there is a dispute between the Majlis and the Guardian Council. So essentially the Guardian Council says, no, this doesn't comply with the basic laws of Islam. And then the Expediency Council figures out kind of the compromise or the solution between the Majlis and the Guardian Council. And they also may originate their own legislation within the Majlis. So an interesting kind of, in some ways, interestingly redundant council or group, but it's interesting to see kind of a need for another group that exists. And the last one is the Assembly of Experts. So this is interesting because they're on the religious or theocratic side of things, but they are actually directly elected by people. So essentially, there are elections, but they are all of religious leaders running against each other. So mostly, if not all, hardliners kind of running against each other in an election. So what the most important role of the Assembly of Religious Experts is that they elect the supreme leader, and technically speaking, they have the right to dismiss him. So it's really interesting to think about. Kind of like we said, there's only been two, and it's hard to come up with sort of a roadmap in which they would actually exercise this power, unless this. I don't know. I don't want to speculate too much. But to me, I always think like if the supreme leader turns out to not be as hardline as was previously thought, then maybe or took the country in sort of a completely strange, surprising new direction. Maybe you'd have conflict between the new leader and sort of the hardliners within the government here, but I actually think that's not super likely. So in candidates for the Assembly of Religious Experts, like we said, they're drawn from a lot of the same pools of the other people that exist within the country. Within the government or the theocratic elements of government, they are subject to approval by the Guardian Council. So again, you're not going to get just people going rogue and sort of ending up on the Assembly of Religious Experts by accident. And interestingly enough, some are actually in the Guardian Council too. So it is a drawing from a lot of the same pool of people. So kind of just to repeat, kind of we have all of these elements of government. I think it's really important to know what the supreme leader does, and also to know what the Guardian Council does. And also to know that the Assembly of Religious Experts, their main job is to essentially pick the supreme leader. So yeah, thanks.